Dialed In Angling Podcast presented by Onyx Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Runnings, Visit Watertown, South Dakota, Mantrap Lake Lodge, and Visit Cook County. Well, this week, it's sort of last call for summer walleyes or last call for summer. A lot of people, this marks the end of their summer. Kids are going back to school next week. Labor Day weekend is upon us. It's the Minnesota State Fair, all of which we touched on last week in the podcast or sort of alluded to. Now the fair, it's the last week to get down there. Again, if you're down there, swing by the Minnesota Bound booth, the cabin. I know guys like Bill Shirk will be down there, Travis Frank, Laura Shera, the whole crew from Ron Shera Productions. There'll be a lot of us hanging out down there, so swing on down to the fair and say hi. Well, it truly is last call for fishing, at least for a lot of people. This is sort of this is the last weekend that they can get out. You know, sure, a lot of people have some fall fishing to do, or maybe they have plans of heading up to their cabin and doing a little bit more fishing and not just winterizing the boats. But this sort of marks the end. You know, the kids start to go back to school, and here we are. You know, I want to touch on this week more talking about some big walleye patterns. You know, the tournaments up at Lake of the Woods over the last few weeks have really piqued my interest as far as big walleye potential and what you can do to put big walleyes in the boat. I'm going to get more into detail on that in a minute. You know, we'll get into tournament results and some of the things that are shaking out at Lake of the Woods. But, you know, if you are heading up to the lakes this weekend, you know, a lot of people I know, traffic's already starting to build heading north, even as early as today and Thursday. You know, if you are coming up, it looks like a little bit cooler temperatures. So, you know, fishing should be pretty good. I want to get into some big walleye techniques as the podcast progresses today and talk about some of my go-tos as far as targeting specifically big walleyes. And I'm not talking about like just going out targeting numbers of walleyes, but finding big fish. First of all, how to find them, where to find them, and then, of course, targeting them with specific techniques. Because what I've learned when it comes to big walleyes is it's a little bit different animal than just targeting walleyes. You know, it's more of a hunt for the big fish versus just throwing on schools or fish that are located in the weed edges or on these humps. Sure, you might have a big fish that relates to the weed lines, but typically you're finding these fish by themselves or in an isolated area. So I want to get into that. I'll also cover techniques. But first, let's touch on what kind of triggered this whole podcast for me. And it's these giant bags that keep coming out of Lake of the Woods on the Minnesota side. There's been a couple tournaments over the last few weeks. First off, mid-August, they had the Dave Anderson Memorial Warrior Boat Shootout, and the numbers were phenomenal. We're talking, you know, averages, you know, walleye bag averages in that 9 to 10 pound range. Now, granted, a lot of these tournaments are catch, record, release, which is great. You know, obviously in Minnesota, you can only boat or have one in possession over 20 inches. So allowing these catch, record, release tournaments, you know, where these fish can be photographed and then released right back in their environment, I'm all for that. I've talked on this podcast many times. I'm a huge fan of tournaments. I love tournament fishing. I've fished a lot of tournaments in the past. I'm all for tournaments. However, doing it right and making sure that we're protecting our resources is first and foremost. And to have these catch, record, release tournaments rather than having a catch tournament where you're bagging these fish and bringing them up on a stage, weighing them, and then trying to release this fish. It just doesn't work very well for walleyes. And I've said it in the past, like I would love to see bass tournaments go to this, you know, this major league fishing format, or at the very least having 5 fish where it's catch, record, release. I love doing tournaments like that. My son Robbie and I fished the Lund Mania tournament. It's that way. Most walleye tournaments have gone that way simply because of the fact that regulations don't allow you to have a weigh tournament anymore. I know there's a few that still exist out there where they still have a weigh tournament. I wish they'd just all go to a catch, record, release for this for this reason, of just putting the fish back in their environment. I think survival rates and hooking mortality is through the roof as far as survival rates, and hooking mortality is lower when you are taking a picture of these fish and then immediately putting them back in the water rather than dragging them all over the lake. Even if conditions are ideal as far as surface temperatures, you're still putting a fish in your live well, banging it around on lakes like Lake of the Woods or Leech Lake or any of these big bodies of water. It's just not healthy for those fish. So tournaments like this MTT that just happened, where it's a catch, record, release, it allows you to showcase some of the big fish potential that are in these lakes. And then also you're putting those fish right back in the water where you caught them. Most of the fish aren't harmed. And I would say survival rate on a lot of these tournaments has to be way up there, especially on like Lake of the Woods or some of these lakes where you don't have fish, where you're not dragging fish out of extreme deep water. Lake of the Woods is one of those prime examples. Is, yeah, it gets a little bit deeper, but a lot of these fish are suspended in the water column. So, you're not killing these fish. So let's just chat a little bit about some of these tournament results. This MTT that just happened this last weekend, I was sort of following it because I have a lot of friends that are fishing it. It's the MTT Championship. If you're not familiar with the MTT, it's the Minnesota Tournament Trail. It's a walleye series. This is a 2-day tournament at the end of their season. Over the years, I've had a lot of friends that have fished the MTT. It's sort of a fun weekend series. A bunch of them go out of Hunters Point throughout the year. I know they fish Winnie, they fish Leech, they fish Lake of the Woods. The bags that they put up at Lake of the Woods is what I want to chat about. And again, this is what kind of sparked my idea for talking about big walleyes in particular. This tournament, was covered by Target Walleye, did some stuff on this tournament. I've seen a lot of stuff on Facebook, on Instagram. Like I said, I followed this tournament just because I have a lot of friends fishing it. But just to put it in perspective for you, a 2-day tournament that happened last week. So this is in August, right? To win the tournament, 180 and Travis Boyum put up a bag of 109 pounds for 2 days. So they had 109 pounds, 0.84, right? Another good buddy of mine and friends, Stephen Roller, he guides with me. Pat McSherry has done some guide trips. You'll know Pat from In-Depth Outdoors. Pat has also been on Dialed In Angling. They got second place, 109.44. So you're talking 0.40 difference between first and second, both of which put up over 100 and almost 110 pounds for 2 days. That's incredible, right? You go down the list, you have Charlie McGovern, Matt Stearns, 106 pounds, right, for third place. Fourth place, you've got Jeff Breska and Jimmy Swaggart, 104 pounds. And the list goes on. They're over 100 pounds. Basically, to get under 100 pounds, they're right around that 8th or 9th place. Can you imagine rolling into a tournament with 100 pounds of walleyes and then getting 9th place? I mean, that is something to be said about the fishery up at Lake of the Woods, something to be said about the anglers, something to be said about forward-facing sonar, the way these anglers are targeting these fish. It's phenomenal. These are numbers and weights in bags that you just really didn't see 5 years ago. If you did, it was like somebody talked about it. I remember back in the day, my Uncle Gary had, close to 100 pounds out in Lake Erie. I know there's been some other anglers in the PWT and the NWT that have had weights like this. But to have this up at Lake of the Woods, and the numbers were pretty close to this for that Dave Anderson tournament as well. And so just goes to show you forward-facing sonar is changing the game. Good, bad, otherwise. You guys know, if you listen to Dialed In Angling podcast, I'm a huge fan of forward-facing sonar. I love targeting big fish. I will say one thing, as far as these anglers that are targeting these big fish, a lot of which are throwing baits at these fish, and we'll get into some of those techniques in a minute. But I think hooking mortality is way lower than it used to be than, let's say, even 4 or 5 years ago or prior to forward-facing sonar. And my take on this is simply the fact that they're pitching at fish, right? Rather than trolling lead core, for example, I know just guiding on Mille Lacs, I would troll lead core for a month and a half straight at certain times a year because that was the only way you could put fish in the boat consistently. And yes, there are probably some anglers that are on this list that did a little bit of trolling, but a lot of which are pitching at fish. And so I'm not knocking on lead core trolling. I think, it's a phenomenal tool to catching fish, and I still do some lead core trolling. I'm going to talk about it. It's just a good way to put big numbers of big fish in the boat. But the downfall of trolling lead core is when you start getting below 3 colors. So you start putting out 4 or 5 colors, you increase your speed. You're trying to target fish that are deeper than 25 or 30 feet. In that aspect, you start running into barrel trauma, fish that are coming out at deeper water. They're being dragged behind a boat at, 50, 60, 70 yards at 2 miles an hour. They're filling up with water. You're recording, you're taking a picture of this fish, and you're releasing the fish. Now, anglers with forward-facing sonar are seeing fish, throwing at them with specific baits, whether it's a bobber, it could be a jigging wrap, it could be a jig crawler, it could be a crankbait. But you're casting at these fish, right? And you're targeting fish that are suspended, and you're catching that fish little or no stress, and you're putting that fish back in the water. Now, to me, those are fish that have a better survival rate than someone that has a downrigger down, right? And that is dragging fish out of deep water. Now, again, not ripping on trolling, downrigging, anything like that. I'm a huge fan of throwing crankbaits. I'm a huge fan of trolling crankbaits. But now with forward-facing sonar, I tend to target fish that are higher in the water column. It seems like a lot of these bigger fish are up anyway. So I'm not dragging these fish that are off the bottom. I can remember lead core trolling on Mille Lacs or lead core trolling on Lake of the Woods and putting 4.5 colors out there and catching tons of small saugers, catching tons of small walleyes that I wasn't trying to target, and trying to release those fish back, and they just weren't making it. And so ended up keeping some of those fish, because you got a 10 or a 12-inch, 11-inch sauger on that's been drugged behind lead core for a half hour. I mean, that fish just isn't going to survive. And so now when I'm trolling, I'm targeting fish that are a little bit higher. I'm also casting way more than I ever was. And so are a lot of these anglers that are fishing these tournaments. It's amazing the bags that and the numbers they put up in these bags here, especially in the last couple tournaments on Lake of the Woods. First of all, it speaks volumes of the anglers that are fishing this. Second of all, it speaks volumes of Lake of the Woods as a fishery to produce fish and weights like this as far as big fish. I tell you what, if you're looking to catch big walleyes and you want to get good at forward-facing sonar and you just want to catch walleyes, the walleye capital of the world has been named for good reason. Lake of the Woods has giant fish, and it is one of my favorite destinations as far as catching big fish. I mean, if you're looking to get out of the doldrums of fishing anywhere in Minnesota right now, and you just want to scratch that itch of catching big walleyes, these tournament results should tell you that all you got to do is book a cabin at Arneson's and go up there and start catching some of these big walleyes. Because if you look down, I'm not going to go through all the numbers and the weights of this tournament, but just to give you an example that, let's see, 24th place. I'm not going to name the people. They were sitting at 90 pounds of fish for 2 days. 24th place, 90 pounds. That tells you, and that speaks volumes about how big a fish Lake of the Woods are kicking out right now. So I'm going to take a quick break, but when I get back, I want to talk about, first of all, where to target these big fish, not just on Lake of the Woods, but you can do this on smaller lakes. It's amazing how many small lakes in Minnesota have big walleyes. I'm going to talk about locations that you can target those fish. I'm also going to break down some of my favorite and some of my go-to techniques for targeting big walleyes. specifically when it comes to forward-facing sonar, but also talk a few trolling techniques because I know there's a lot of people out there that still like trolling and maybe don't have forward-facing sonar. Some of those techniques that you can do to put these giant walleyes in the boat, just like these anglers did at the last MTT. So stay tuned. We got more Dialed In Angling coming your way.
Man Trap Lodge, a Park Rapids resort on beautiful Big Man Trap Lake. Features 16 decked-out private cabins with air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and a rare Northwood swimming pool. Cabins are available with 1 to 5 bedroom units to select from. Whether you're looking for a fishing trip, a family vacation, or a family reunion, Man Trap Lodge is the Park Rapids resort for you. Rent one of our fishing boats for a great day of fishing or a pontoon to cruise around the lake and relax. Man Trap Lodge is a truly magical Minnesota vacation spot that's fun for the whole family. Don't miss your chance to book your late summer or fall trip at Man Trap Lodge for some fantastic fishing. Check us out at mantraplodge.com.
Runnings Home, Farm, and Outdoor stores are celebrating 78 years, serving 90 local communities across the Upper Midwest, the Northeast, and America's Heartland. Runnings has everything you and your family need for your home, on the farm, and in the outdoors. Lawn and garden, hardware, farm and ranch supplies, sporting goods, housewares, snacks, and everything for your pets. Go to runnings.com to find one of the 90 locations near you, or shop online anytime at runnings.com. Runnings, your home, farm, and outdoor store.
Watertown, South Dakota is your hub for year-round fishing in the heart of the Glacial Lakes region. With Lakes Kempeska and Pelican right in town and dozens more just a short drive away, you'll find non-stop action for walleye, perch, and pike, just to name a few. When you're off the water, explore the Terry Redlin Art Center, Bramble Park Zoo, and many other great museums. Plus, award-winning pizza and family-friendly fun around every corner. Easy to reach, hard to leave. Plan your next cast at visitwatertownsd.com. So much Watertown, so little time.
Welcome back. Okay, let's start with areas in which I find a lot of big walleyes. And this changes throughout the year. So I want to kind of specifically target right now and then as we lead into the fall, because things are going to change rapidly, especially on small lakes where vegetation's starting to die off. You're starting to get fish that are going to pull off the weed lines. If you listen to last week's podcast, I touched on walleye fishing, but I mainly was talking about, panfish and how panfish movements are in the fall. Big walleyes are kind of like that right now. You're seeing some fish that are suspended and sort of using the basins to feed on bait fish out there, but you have a lot of walleyes that are kind of hanging on the edges of those weed lines. A lot of these fish will go out into deeper water during the day and then slide back to the weed lines in the evening, especially on smaller lakes. But when I say going deeper, back in the day, I always used to think, and I was always told that high sun, bright sunshine, especially clear lakes, that these walleyes leave the shallows and they go deep and they sit on the bottom all day and they don't come back and feed till evening. Now with forward-facing sonar, we found out that myth is busted, right? Walleyes just don't go out to deep water and just sit there. There's times where you'll find them on deep humps or they're using deeper water to feed on, smaller, let's say, it could be crayfish, it could be darter minnows, it could be shiners that are in depths of water, especially on lakes where you don't have a thermocline, they might slide deep. But on a lot of lakes, it seems like those fish will remain in the weeds, or they'll pull off a little bit, or they'll use the basin and they'll go back and forth. There's certainly lakes where you can target these fish in the basin, but some of these fish might only be 4 feet below the surface. Other times they're 10 feet down, 15 feet down, 20 feet down. I was on a lake last week where the majority of the fish were out in the basin, most of which were either 4 or 5 feet down, and they were all over 30 feet of water. But there were cases where I did see fish out in 15, 20, 25 feet. And these fish were just as fluid in the water column as the fish that were up high. Now, the fish that were up high in the water column bit a lot better. And I noticed that a lot when I'm basing fishing. Simple fact that a lot of these fish that are high in the water column, they bite, and the ones that are down a little bit just don't feed as well. Same can be said along these weed lines. Some of these fish that I see with forward-facing sonar that I can actually see on the outside of these cabbage, maybe up in the water column a little bit, and I throw, let's say, a bobber on them or something, boom, those fish will strike. It seems like the fish that are buried down in the weeds, they're just not as active, not as aggressive. Same can be said for a lot of these fish that are on humps. Even if I can see them and they're sitting closer to the bottom, they're never feeding quite as well as those fish that are up 1 or 2 feet. So keep that in mind when you're using forward-facing sonar and you're looking for fish that are active, aggressive, and biting. These fish that are higher in the water column typically are fish that are biting. And that goes for a lot of different species, but specifically walleyes. Now, finding big walleyes versus a bunch of walleyes is two different things. I've noticed the big walleyes aren't always in the big packs of fish. They're typically by themselves. There might be 1 or 2 around the area. And if you find, a big pack of fish, they're typically smaller fish. So when I'm guiding and I'm looking for fish to keep, for example, I'm looking for these numbers of walleyes. Sometimes they're in the weeds. Sometimes they're on the humps. Sometimes they're both. Sometimes they're on rock piles. Sometimes they're out suspended, and you'll hit schools of these eater, air quotes, eater size walleyes. Most of the time when I find those schools like that, they're almost always eater size walleyes. They're not in this category that I would say are big fish. Most of the big fish I find are by themselves, right? And they could be in smaller basins or depressions around structure. They could be on the edges of these weed lines. A lot of these inside turns or these main lake points that are sort of textbook walleye locations, I've seen a lot of big fish just hanging on the edges of structures, but I find more big fish on like those inside turns than I do on those big main lake points. Those kind of like, I used to think of them as like a funnel area for walleyes to come and go morning and evening. And I still do when it comes to winter, these high percentage areas where these walleyes are coming up onto the structure to feed, and then they're sliding back down into deeper water. Now, depending on the depth of the structure will a lot of times dictate at what depth those fish will come off and suspend at, if that makes sense. So like for Mille Lacs example, if you're looking around mud flats and you see the mud flats top out at 21 to 24 feet, when those walleyes come off that mud flat, a lot of times they'll just sort of extend that depth out at 24 feet, and they'll go out into the basin at that depth. Same thing if you get a 21-foot flat, right? If it's 21 feet and those fish are kind of hanging at 21 feet, as soon as they slide off the edge, they don't swim along the bottom all the time. Especially if they're targeting suspended bait fish like yellow perch, even small ciscos, shiners, whatever, they'll slide off at the same depth as that structure. I see the same thing happen on small lakes. I have this really nice sort of cabbage bed or mid-lake hump that gets filled with weeds throughout the summer months. When those fish come off that edge, they'll sort of suspend out at that same depth. Like I said the other day, the lake I was on had lots of little basins and lots of structure. It was a lake that, I fish quite often for guiding, and it's a small lake. And the cool part about forward-facing sonar is I've learned how many walleyes are in some of these small lakes that you just never knew had walleyes in it. Yes, I use my Onyx Fish app to look at some of the data on some of these lakes, and that sort of propels me to go try some of these lakes. In past podcasts, I've talked about trying different lakes that my son Robbie and I have tried. I do it all the time now, and I feel totally confident going to these lakes because I can use some of the data that I get from Onyx Fish, and then I go to these lakes and I find out, for myself, how many walleyes are in this lake and, if it has this big fish potential. And it's amazing how many small bodies of water have a ton of walleyes in them that I drove by all the time that I thought of as sort of this weedy, choked out lake that I was never able to fish because prior to forward-facing sonar, it was hard to tell the forest from the trees. Or it was a lake that I knew had a lot of walleyes in it. I used to catch them in the spring there or in the fall, but throughout most of the summer months when the vegetation got really tall or thick. I just wasn't able to fish it fast or efficiently enough to know if there was walleyes in there. Now I can go to these lakes and I catch them quite frequently. And so don't overlook some of these small lakes for walleyes. You think you have to go to Lake of the Woods, Mille Lacs, Leech, Winnie, Lake of, Vermilion to catch these big walleyes. That's not always the case. I have a couple that come to mind right now that are very, very small lakes that I've caught 28, 29, 30, 31-inch walleyes on that would blow your mind. Like if I were to name that lake on this podcast right now, a lot of people would be shocked, especially if they pulled up the lake itself and how it sets up with the weed lines and how it's sort of a panfish style lake. A lot of these lakes have big fish potential because there's food there, right? Anytime you're dealing with a small lake that has a ton of panfish, a ton of, the right makings of, let's say, perch, but has some deep water where you may have some good numbers of Cisco's or shiners in there, boom, you're going to have big fish potential. So let's get back to talking about specific locations on structure. I've touched on some of these locations off structure, but on structure, when it comes to late summer like this, weed lines in particular, I'm looking for big standing stock cabbage. I'm looking for, sometimes a little bit of coontail, but more of that really tall cabbage, especially in clear lakes, and cabbage that has, let's say, a really sharp weed line or has access to deep water, for example, where you have a pretty sharp break and it may flatten out and then those fish can move out to deep water. So I talked a little earlier about inside turns on the structure. So funnel areas which those fish move. A lot of those big fish will just set up during the day on that inside turn. They're kind of faced out in the weeds, especially inside turns or flattened areas that are facing the wind. I always look at fish and wind and walleyes. They try to utilize that wind or use the wind to their best advantage. And so they might move around on that particular structure that has, sort of those features that I just talked about. Also, deep water access, right? Walleyes tend to like those mid-lake humps that have deep water access. Also, doesn't hurt if you've got some of these humps that have cabbage on it, but have great big boulders. Any sort of structure like that are things that I really look for and keying in on when I pull into the area. And I should say, and I've said it before, when I pull up to a hump, I don't instantly start fishing. I don't just pop my forward-facing sonar down and start casting. I'm looking, right? I have one active target on a pole that I use for driving around the edges of these humps. I'm looking for fish. I'm looking to see how the structure's set up. I'll drive around. I also use side imaging. In that side imaging, I can see those rocks really well on the bottom, especially if it's in vegetation. I can see how the drop-offs lay out. I can see fish out to the side that I may not be looking at. And so using that side imaging in conjunction with the forward-facing sonar, I can cover water very, very quickly. Now, I also want to talk a little bit more about targeting fish that move off of that structure, because that's a huge part of targeting some of these big walleyes. If these fish aren't on structure, they're off structure. And with forward-facing sonar, the big advantage to me and a lot of these anglers that were just up at Lake of the Woods, because I would say 90% of these fish were targeted out in the basin at Lake of the Woods. And that's being able to find those fish at anywhere in the water column, but out away from structure, not worrying about structure. Some of these fish probably came adjacent to structure, but I think a lot of them just came out of that basin on the south shore. And these anglers found these big roaming schools of walleyes that happen on Lake of the Woods, but they also happen on small lakes where these fish will get out off the edge. They just suspend and they're just pretty much pelagic throughout most of the summer months, but especially this time of year until those fish start to come in to feed. So I would say the big transition for walleyes that are suspended out in these small basins on a small lake, but also on Lake of the Woods type of basin, is when the water temps start to cool rapidly and you start to get bait fish that move back into the shorelines. That's when these fish will just follow. And so a lot of these basin fish will just quickly slide back into shallower water. They'll start moving like Lake of the Woods. They start moving up towards the Rainy River. if you listen to this podcast this spring, I did a Rainy River run, right? I always do it in the spring, but I also like to go in the fall, because in the fall, when the shiners start to run, these walleyes come in there in big numbers. And guess what? There's hardly any anglers up there in the fall targeting these fish. It seems like everybody has this pent-up walleye angler and this angling desire in the spring. But when it comes to fall fishing, they sort of forget about Lake of the Woods or Rainy River, right? They've had a lot of fall fishing. They're ready for hunting. They're ready to put their boat away. Whatever the reason, there just isn't very much traffic up at Lake of the Woods in the fall like you see in the spring, especially in the Rainy River. And it can be equally as good, if not better, in the fall than it is the spring. So think about that. It's still a timing thing, right? You need to time out the shiner run, just like you time out the spring run of walleyes that are coming up to spawn. Not a whole lot different when it comes to fall fishing. You have to time that out. So it's hard to put a hard date on a calendar just to say, hey, we're going to Lake of the Woods October 1st and, we're going to hit the run. It doesn't always work out like that. But sometime in the fall, when these fish really start to come in, that's time where you're like, you know what, we should get up there. So if you've never done that fall run, that shiner run, you've got to experience it. It's pretty awesome. It's right up there with targeting big walleyes anywhere. Let's take one more break. We'll pause for some sponsors, but when I come back, I want to break down some techniques, some of my go-to techniques, and then I'm going to break down a few spots that I want to go this fall to target great big walleyes, just because I love big fish. And targeting big walleyes is just one of the things that I absolutely love doing. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a second. onX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Quickly filter lakes by species, then select trophy potential, high abundance, keeper potential, or high stocking effort to find the fish you're after in the size and the numbers you are trying to catch. Download from the App Store today to get research tools for the serious anglers and beginners alike, giving you the data to target the right lakes and the confidence to get there. Use tools like recent imagery, fishing hotspot data, or the best-in-class weather features that call out current wind, weather, barometer, moon phase, majors and minors, along with precip and more. onX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you'd never known existed. Download onX Fish Midwest today, the app that is changing the game on ice and open water.
Visit Cook County, Minnesota, a year-round fishing destination like no other. Spring brings steelhead and smelt runs along the Lake Superior shoreline. In summer, cast for walleye, lake trout, and northern pike in the region's inland lakes and rivers. As the leaves change, so does the fishing, with fall offering some of the best lake trout action around. When winter settles in, grab your gear and head out for ice fishing in a true northern wilderness setting. Whether you're an experienced angler or just discovering the joy of casting a line, Cook County has a spot and a season for you. Learn more and start planning your fishing trip at visitcookcounty.com.
Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site, full-service bar and restaurant. The two beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. Okay, so I want to talk about a few destinations in which I'm going to target big walleyes this fall. And obviously there's some small lakes in there. I'm not going to call out the small lakes. I will call out some of the bigger body destinations. We already talked a little bit about the Shiner Run on Lake of the Woods, but I want to talk about some of these destinations. One, if you listen to a podcast a few weeks ago, I had Marcus Quam on. He always talks about this big fish bite in the fall. and this big walleye bite in the fall where they're getting ridiculous size walleyes, in that 12, 13, 14 pound range. That to me, I got to see it for myself. So I will definitely be, obviously if weather is conducive, I try to end my guiding season sort of mid-October so I can experience some different fall fishing for myself. I also love hunting, but I've got to scratch that fall itch before I get on the ice, and always for me, fall fishing really comes down to walleye fishing. I love fall walleye fishing. I might do a little bit of fall bass fishing, let's say earlier in the fall. And what I mean by earlier in the fall would be mid-September till the first part of October. I also like targeting jumbo perch. I always have. You guys know I'm panfish head, so I like touching on and doing a few panfish trips in the fall. But really, when it comes to later in the fall, like late October, I don't do a ton of musky fishing anymore. And so my focus is always on big walleyes. And so when Marcus talked to me a little bit about that big fish potential that he has out there in his neck of the woods as far as catching those fish, I'm definitely doing that this year. That will be, as long as the weather is conducive, I'm heading out to South Dakota. I'm going to fish with Marcus and do that big fish and fish those big walleyes in South Dakota. Another one that I've done in the past that is an absolute blast, Lake Sakakawea. Caught a bunch of big walleyes on Lake Sakakawea earlier in October. Went out there on it was a pheasant hunting trip. So I guess it, kind of early to mid-October, but went out there with some friends, caught some on jig wraps, threw some plastics. That lake in particular, those walleyes are smelt eaters. And so as that water starts to cool down, those smelts start to come in a little bit shallower. The walleyes follow. That's another lake that has big fish. Not sure if I'll get out there this year or not. It all depends on the pheasant season, also the weather during the pheasant season. When we brought our boat out there, I was out there with Nick Sakella and then Mitch Hackemuller. He brought his boat out there when we went pheasant hunting. Super, super nice, obviously extended summer type of weather when we brought our boat. So that was sort of an afterthought to bring that boat with, and man, what a treat. So, if you're looking for a destination to go to catch big walleyes, Sakakawea should certainly be on your list or on your radar, especially if you're a pheasant hunter or you like getting out to North Dakota to shoot ducks or whatever. Bring the boat with you. Devil's Lake is another one where those walleyes move shallow, catching some big fish. I wouldn't say, Devil's Lake proper, you're going to target a bunch of 9-10 pounders. Obviously, the potential is still there, but good numbers of walleyes on Devil's Lake. Now you shift over to Minnesota. I know for me, I already talked about Lake of the Woods, the Shiner run in the fall on the Rainy River. That is a must do. If you've never done it, you've got to go over there and do that. That's an absolute no-brainer. And then, of course, Mille Lacs Lake. Mille Lacs is starting to get some bigger fish once again. I would say this year, maybe, especially this year, that you can do some night trolling, which is cool. Haven't been able to do that for a few years. So I'll probably do that one evening just because it's so close to my house and I do a lot of guiding on Mille Lacs. But I would say in the next couple of years, based on this 2013 year class that we still see in the lake, and we're seeing the lake get really, really healthy with bayfish numbers, I am seeing a ton of fish in that 24, 25, 26 inch range right now that are starting to get into those big fish areas where I think over the next 2 seasons, you're going to see more 26, 27, 28 inch walleyes like we're accustomed to seeing on Mille Lacs just because of the sheer amount of bait fish on Mille Lacs. So those are kind of the ones that are on my radar right now. I should mention Lake Superior as well. I don't have a ton of familiarity with fishing that in the fall, but I definitely want to get up there based on what I was seeing on Facebook, Instagram, the tournament, the AIM tournament or whatever they had up there. Just the sheer amount of big fish that they were catching shallow and up on Lake of the Woods. That has really, really piqued my interest as far as getting up there. And so that's another one that, should be on your radar. And Leech Lake, that's another one that I will definitely be hitting just because the amount of guide trips that I do on Leech Lake. I love targeting fish shallow. And in the fall, if you've never fished Leech Lake, there's so many times where if you get the same wind for 2 or 3 days in a row, you go to some of these shallow water rock areas and you can pull 26, 27, 28-inch fish out of under 5 feet of water, throwing jigs and plastics. It's really hard to beat that. And even just catching these fish shallow in general on Leech Lake, it's really hard to beat, because it's one of my favorite things to do in the fall is throwing jigs and plastics, jigs and big minnows, even rigging big minnows. You can all do that stuff on Lake of the Woods. All that stuff is coming up. So I want to get into my next topic, and that is will be my final topic for this podcast, and that's the techniques that I use for targeting big fish, not just now, but as we get into the fall. I think right now, yes, you can certainly go and capitalize on big fish in certain lakes, especially small lakes where you're targeting one big fish suspended in a basin, or you go up to Lake of the Woods, you're targeting lots of big fish in a basin. But as we get towards fall, as the weed lines start to die off, big fish just start feeding. They start getting active. They start getting more aggressive. I always think of surface temperature, right? Like right now, a lot of our lakes' surface temperature is 70, 71, 72. It's dropping rapidly with these cooler temps that we've had here in Minnesota, these nighttime lows. The days are getting shorter. 2, 3, 4 weeks from now, it's amazing how much surface temperature we'll have lost just based on the daytime being shorter and based on the nighttime lows. It's amazing how quickly surface temperatures can drop and water temperatures drop in the fall just based on that alone. You look at, let's say, last year or the last couple falls, we've had sort of this extended summer, right? This Indian summer, if you will. And you'd think, surface temperature is going to be right up there, still in the 70s, blah, blah, blah. No, surface temperature still dropped pretty quickly. And the closer you get to October 1st sort of marks that where fall starts for me. I know we're talking last call for summer here, but really summer doesn't end, or summer patterns for walleyes don't really end until, I would say, that third week in September most of the time. And then you start seeing things shift. You start seeing weed lines die off, vegetation changing as far as dying. You start seeing fish that move off those humps. As soon as that vegetation starts dying off, you start seeing these fish move out off the edges. All of a sudden, it seems like you get into first part of October, even mid-October, you get that turnover period that happens, that week of turnover where surface temperatures are cooler than the water down below, and boom, those turnover times start to happen right around 55 or below, around 50. But even that first part of October, when surface temperatures are in the 60s, things start happening quickly. Fish start feeding. Things open up as far as techniques. And so let's start with some of my techniques that I'm currently using, and then we'll get into techniques that I'll be using as we get towards the fall. Number one on the list right now, and it should be on everybody's list as far as catching big fish, is jig wraps, right? Last week I talked about different size jig wraps that I use. Number 7s, number 9s, even the new number 11s that are coming out are all great fish catchers. Jig wrap you can start using in the spring. You use it all the way into the fall. Now, where I commonly use jig wraps versus any other technique would be a little bit deeper water. So if you're in 15, 20 feet, even fish that are suspended, swimming jig wraps or dumping them down to the bottom in that, below 15 feet, jig wraps really shine. What I love about jig wraps this time of year is you can throw a bobber on a fish, for example, comes up, doesn't eat it, goes away. You throw a jig wrap out in front of them and you snap that jig wrap, you get their attention in a hurry. And so jig wraps are always right up there on the list for me. There's hardly ever a time that I don't have a jig wrap tied up in my boat. I've always got at least one jig wrap tied up. So number 7 jig and wrap would be right up there with some of the best big fish techniques that you can use. Number 2 would be a bobber. I just talked about it a little bit. Having a slip bobber out there, especially if you're new to forward-facing sonar, It's really easy to get your distances down, and then, of course, your depths down with a slip bobber. Now, it's not just any slip bobber, and this is how my setups go as follows. It's the slip bobber. I've got a slip knot, a bead, a bobber, another bead. I've been using these sniper swivels. Absolutely love the VMC sniper swivels. I know they're not on the market yet, but they take the place of that egg sinker or whatever people were using in the past to get their slip bobbers down there quickly. The sniper swivel basically eliminates the egg sinker. It eliminates the swivel, combines it into one. So now you have a slip knot, a bobber, a bead, a sniper swivel, and then I like to run a 3 or 4 foot leader. Sometimes I'll go a little bit longer with my leaders if the fish are really finicky, but for casting example, it's really easy to cast a 2 or 3 foot leader. And then I typically will use like a 16th ounce jig on there, tipped with a leech or a night crawler. Those are sort of my go-tos this time of year. Sometimes I'll add a split shot too between the sniper swivel and the jig. It all depends on, how quickly I need to get that bait down there or how deep I'm fishing. But it's amazing with forward-facing sonar and talking about targeting fish shallow throughout the year now. I would say throughout, from May, June, July, August, now as we get into September, most of the time my slip knot rigs and my slip bobber rigs, I would say I don't go a whole lot deeper than 15 to 20 feet tops. And then, I'm fishing as shallow as, let's say, 6 or 7. But that's sort of the realm or the depths I'm fishing these walleyes. So it kind of gives you that perspective of where I'm targeting these fish all season long, right? In the spring, I might start a little bit shallower. I do a lot more jig fishing. But as soon as the jig fishing or the plastics bite slows down, I go to the slip bobber rigs and then I start jig wrapping. So keep that in mind. And then as you get into summer here, even though some of these fish are suspended off the edge, some of them are only 10 feet down, 15 feet down, some are only 4 feet down, 5 feet down, whatever it may be, or 20 feet down. I tend to keep my bobber rigs within that 6 to 20 foot range. That's where I'm typically fishing these bobbers, but I'm chasing fish all over. Some are on structure, some are big pods of walleyes that are on structure. Some are in the weeds, some are in the rocks, some are suspended off the edge, but I can adjust that bobber quickly to get on top of those fish. My main advice to you, if you're throwing bobbers on fish, try to keep it slightly above those fish. The clearer the water you can get away with, even if you're off by 2 or 3 feet, a lot of times they see that bait, they'll come up and investigate it. But if you can keep it within 1.5 feet of those fish, most of the time you're going to get bit. If you dump that bobber on top of them, you're going to get bit. And so keeping those bobbers kind of within 1.5 feet of those fish, you're going to catch way, way more fish. But driving around looking for fish with forward-facing sonar and slip bobbers is just, again, another technique that I really use. And if you're targeting big walleyes, not just groups and numbers of walleyes, it's a good way to get your distances down. It's a good way to get your depths down. And it's just a good way to get familiar with forward-facing sonar and what you're looking at. Because sometimes with forward-facing sonar, you're looking for fish out in the basin. You're wanting to see walleyes. You're wanting to see fish. Getting to know species of fish when they're out in a basin, because it's one thing if you're up on Lake of the Woods, that big bright mark out there is a walleye. But if you're on a small lake, is that a bass? Is it a smallmouth bass? Is it a largemouth? Is it panfish? Is it a group of bluegills that look like walleyes? And so by using that bobber, you can get on those fish quickly and get better at forward-facing sonar and sharpshooting these fish. Now, next would be a jig crawler. A lot of these anglers that are putting big weights up right now are using jig crawlers, and pretty simple. I like to use like a VMC Ned head, even their tungsten, their VMC Moon Eye tungsten jigs. What I like about tungsten is you can really see it with forward-facing sonar, but then sliding that night crawler up using half a night crawler and then just throwing it out, letting it fall, and then slowly retrieving or working that night crawler above those fish. Much like it would be like a spinner rig going over the top of those fish. But using that jig crawler is key. There's some new baits that are coming out. VMC has the new jig with the spinner on it. There's a lot of other spinner tech jigs that are out there right now. Even just using like a moon eye jig, if you don't have any of the tungsten jigs, those can work. But I guess my advice to you is using as light a jig as possible to get the job done. And what I mean by that is floating a lighter jig over the top of these fish, whether you're using a 16th ounce jig, an 1/8 ounce, a quarter. I use up to a 1/2 ounce depending on how big the wind is or where I need to cast. But I try to get away with as light a jig as possible for jig crawlering. It'll make sense to you when you go out and start doing it because, okay, let's say it's a really light wind, it's dead flat calm. Most of the fish I'm targeting are just off the edge of these basins that are adjacent to structure, but I am throwing some on weeds. So most of these fish are anywhere from 6 to 15 feet down, for example. Dead flat calm. I'll try to get away with like an 1/8 ounce jig if I can with half a night crawler on there. I'll throw it out past them. I'll work that bait right in front of them and then just steady retrieve that thing back to the boat. Now, if I'm on a lake where the fish are just a little bit deeper than that or the wind starts to come up, I got to throw at fish that are sideways. I got to spot lock and then use my pole rather than using my trolling motor up front. I'll go with a 1/4 ounce jig, 3/8, even a 1/2 ounce, depending on how far down the fish are at. And then also how big a wind I have. I want to be able to get to that fish. You'll understand when you start targeting fish that are in the basin, they're a moving target most of the time. They might not be flying, but they're moving. And you factor in the wind and the waves and trying to get a light jig down there. And so I'll use as light a jig as possible to get the job done because I like to be able to float that jig over the top of them. However, if I'm struggling with those lighter jigs, I just simply upsize to a 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce. And again, using tungsten is huge as far as being able to see that bait. It's really, really nice to be able to use tungsten versus any other jig. So, that tungsten, that VMC tungsten moon eye jig is really a go-to for me. Another technique that I use a lot for big walleyes, but walleyes in general, if you're targeting just specific fish and you want to get good at forward-facing sonar, that's rigs and chubs, right? You can cast chubs out at fish, but also you can rig and live bait rig. So what I'll do is if I'm seeing fish on the bottom, especially as we get towards fall here, I absolutely love rigging creek chubs or red tails, but creek chubs in particular. You can use a sniper swivel. You can use an egg sinker. You can use any type of sinker to get down there. I like to use a little bit heavier sinkers and then shorter leaders. So let's say I want to get down, fish are 20 to 25 feet, for example. They're on a hump. They're on the edge. They're starting to relate to structure, especially as, the weeds are dying off. Surface temperatures are starting to drop. Hard to beat a rig and a chub. What's fun about rigging chubs is not only is it fun because the bait reacts to the walleyes, but these fish absolutely crush it. And what's cool with forward-facing sonar now is like I'll use an active target on my front trolling motor. I'll also have one in an arm so people can see, but I'll see fish on a hump and then I'll rig over the top of them. So I'll actually kind of move to where the fish are at. And then when I get towards those fish, I slow way down. And when I'm rigging chubs, I like to slow way down and present that bait right to those fish. Rather than that minnow getting away from them, you want to put that chub right in front of their face. And again, using shorter leaders. So I'll use like a egg sinker, a swivel, and then I might only use a 2 or 3 foot lead. And I typically will use monofilament for this. I like mono. I'll get away with the lightest mono possible, whether it was a 6-pound nano. Most of the time it's an 8-pound mono mainline, but then a 6-pound mono leader. I love monofilament if I can get away with it. However, if you're on a lake that has lots of zebra mussels, make sure you're at least using a fluorocarbon leader, if not using fluorocarbon for the entire thing, because nothing worse than setting the hook and then snapping off on a big fish. But what I love about chub fishing in particular, you go over the top of them. As soon as that minnow starts shaking and starts going crazy, it starts getting nervous, those walleyes are following. And a lot of times I'll just kind of peek with my forward-facing sonar to see how close those fish are to my bait. And that'll tell me whether I need to slow down or speed up a little bit. If those fish are, lagging back a little bit, but that minnow is going crazy, I'll slow up a little bit and I'll even pause if I can, almost spot lock there and just let that minnow sit on the bottom and work. and allow that walleye to catch up. Now, if that walleye starts to lag behind, I might speed up a little bit, just to kind of get that fish reinterested and to chase that bait again. But rigging big chubs is really, really fun and an easy way. And you can get away with rigging chubs without having forward-facing sonar, right? You can back troll, you can forward troll and rig chubs. But either way, I like to use, kind of a shorter leader to start to kind of pin that bait to the bottom. Otherwise, those chubs will just swim all over and up in the water column, and they'll do whatever they can to get away from those walleyes. But if you pin them down to the bottom, you're going to get more strikes. And then lastly, trolling crankbaits. Like I said earlier in the podcast, Mille Lacs, you're going to be able to troll at night trolling this time of year, or even evening trolling, even Labor Day weekend. If you don't have forward-facing sonar, if you do, putting a number 5 or number 7 Shad Rap out behind the boat, even if you're off the edge of structure right now, a lot of these fish are suspended. You can cover water quickly trolling, and you can put a lot of fish in the boat. They're going to react to that crankbait. And so forward-facing sonar aside, if you just want to go out and catch fish, get off the edge of the weed line, put a number 5 or number 7 Shad Rap down, and just start trolling the perimeter of the lake. I mean, even if you have a perimeter graph, you can get off the edge of the weed line and have very, very good success trolling. Lead core trolling. I started lead core trolling at least a decade ago, if not more. If you think back, especially when the PWT sort of came to Mille Lacs in the early to mid 2000s, I would say around 2007, 8, 9, right in there. A lot of these guys were coming from the Great Lakes, and they came out here in August and September to fish tournaments for the PWT. And they smoked everybody because these lead core trollers, they could cover water. They were confident at fishing fish in the basin. And for me, lead core trolling was sort of my first glimpse into fishing fish that were out in the basin, that were suspended away from structure, that I could target with confidence. Because I grew up a Minnesota kid fishing structure, fishing river systems where, fish related to current breaks. They were on the edges. They were on humps. Also fishing lakes, they were always on humps. They were on the weed lines. Live bait rigging was huge. Jigging a minnow was huge. Yes, I did a little bit of trolling growing up, but it was primarily on structure. When the PWT and these guys started coming to Mille Lacs Lake and trolling lead core out in the basin, it just opened this whole new realm for me, how to target fish out in a basin and forget structure, right? And just sort of get out into open water and start covering water. Well, for the most part, up until a few years ago, that's how these tournaments were won up at Lake of the Woods. Open water trolling, lead core trolling. You can still put big fish in the boat trolling. It's still a big fish technique. However, things are changing in the sense where you're seeing less and less trollers, more people casting. But having said that, it's hard to beat lead core trolling if you want to catch big walleyes. If you want that big fish potential, if you're someone who wants to target big walleyes, whether you have good electronics or not, now you can, lead core trolling has always allowed you to put those big fish in the boat. But now with forward-facing sonar, honestly, you can run down these fish that are suspended 10, 15, 20 feet down. Now you can see them, identify that it's a big walleye, and troll over the top of them and be ready with your lead core at the proper depth and the right speed to put these fish in the boat. So I'm going to end with that on the podcast. Hopefully that's a lot of information, how to target big walleyes. I know I sort of get off on a tangent when it comes to big fish, but I'm passionate about it. I'm just as passionate as learning and fishing small lakes as I am big bodies of water like Lake of the Woods or Mille Lacs or Leech or anywhere else. And every lake holds different potential. That's what I love. I do love targeting big walleyes on big lakes just because the big fish potential is there way more frequently than some of these smaller lakes. And so that's why I gravitate towards lakes like Lake of the Woods, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, Winnie, Vermilion, all of these big bodies of water that we're so blessed to have here in the Midwest, even Devil's Lake, Sakakawea, getting over to Wisconsin, Green Bay, Winnebago, all big fish potentials. You can scratch that itch around the Midwest with only a few hour to half a day drive. Use some of these techniques and you're going to put a lot of fish in the boat. Hey, good luck. this weekend. If you're heading up north for Memorial Day weekend, lakes should be packed, although it looks like a little bit cooler temps. So a lot of people are going to be doing yard work, putting boats away. You're going to see the wakeboard boats, the ski boats, the jet skis all start to go away as we turn a corner after this weekend and we get into fall. I want to talk more about fall techniques. I'm going to be on lots of different adventures here over the next 4.5, 5 weeks. And so I want to touch on that. So you're going to want to stay tuned to the Dialed In Angling podcast. We appreciate you tuning in each and every week. Good luck fishing and have a safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. I'm Tony Roach, and this has been the Dialed In Angling podcast.